Okay. All right, welcome to Coffee with Cade. Yay! I'm your host, Camille Hammond, and this week our special guest is attorney Meryl Rosenberg, who is a fertility lawyer, and so we're going to talk about fertility law and contracts. Why do people need them? They're important.
Right.
They're very important. So welcome, Meryl.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and hopefully it won't be too boring talking about just contracts.
Oh, no. But it's really important to have someone who actually does this full-time instead of someone who does it once in a while. Mm-hmm. And so feel free to Facebook in and Instagram in your questions. But we're going to get started. So,
perfect.
Meryl, tell me a little bit about how you got into this whole fertility law.
Wow. Okay. Well, I've been doing this for about 25 years, so a long time. My background is biology, science, and psychology.
Wow.
Believe it or not, before I was a lawyer.
Good gracious.
So it was sort of a natural fit for me. I originally started in the world of adoptions when surrogacy and art-assisted reproductive technology was still fairly new.
Okay.
And it was by accident that I started working in the world of adoptions, but not by accident that I have developed in the field of ART work, because it really is true to my heart to help people have a family and do it in a safe way.
Yay! Safety first.
Safety first.
So, okay, you used a couple of terms, if
Yeah.
you would not mind defining those.
Sure.
You talked about surrogacy. You talked about ART.
Yes.
And you talked about adoption.
Okay.
So would you please define those three terms, because they're used,
Sure.
and some people don't use the proper definition. When they say surrogacy, they mean a lot of different things. So could you talk about that?
Well, thank you for asking. That's awesome.
Yes.
So first of all, let me start with ART.
Mm-hmm.
ART is assisted reproductive technology.
Okay.
It refers really generally to there are a lot of processes involved in the world these days with fertility and assistance. So it could be, ART could refer to an intended parent trying to build their family that needs IVF assistance.
Okay.
When we talk about it in the world usually of ART and legal work, we're usually talking about cases where a third party is working together with an intended parent or intended parents.
Okay.
And they're helping them. So it may be an egg donor, it may be a sperm donor, you might even have an embryo donor, or it may be what I talked about as a surrogate. And I was using that term a little loosely. Most cases that I deal with these days are involving gestational carriers or gestational surrogates.
Okay.
So in those cases, she's gestating the baby, she's carrying the baby, but there's no genetic tie to the baby between herself and the child. So the child, she conceives through in vitro fertilization, and it's either going to be from the intended parent or parent's gametes, and again, it might involve a donor or donors, or even an embryo donor, and a gestational carrier or surrogate carrying the pregnancy. As opposed to traditional surrogacy, which would refer to a woman who is it's her own egg, it's her own gametes. So it's very legally different with a traditional surrogacy. She is the biological and genetic parent. So the legal process that is necessary to recognize the intended parents after birth is very different. And I say after birth because in traditional surrogacy, it would be after birth, as opposed to in most cases with gestational surrogacy, there is a pre-birth process, especially in Maryland. Every state is different. So any parentage is determined state by state. So that would involve whether it's a surrogacy case or an adoption case.
Mm-hmm.
Parental rights are determined in accordance with the state laws.
Okay.
Now with surrogacy, not every state and most states actually don't have a law that's applicable. So there might be an applicable law, or there might be case law, or there might be practice. So that feeds right into why you really need to talk to an attorney anytime you're working with a third party who's assisting you in trying to build your family through assisted reproductive technology.
So the 3 points that I got out of that were, if you're trying to have a baby and it doesn't involve you and your partner, you need a lawyer.
Yes, and sometimes even if it's just you and your partner, you need a lawyer.
Let's talk about that. Yes. Why do I need a lawyer if it's just me and my partner?
Right. So, there are a lot of people building their families now that may be in the gay community. So it's really important for them to protect their rights, even though we've made great strides in the legal world with respect to equality and equal rights, especially after the Obergefell decision, which recognized equal marriage. Equal marriage doesn't necessarily mean equal parental rights in every state.
Understood. Okay.
So anybody building their family through assisted reproductive technology, again, whether you're using a sperm donor, an egg donor, an embryo donor, you should talk to an attorney early on, so you know what you need to think about down the road, whether it's before you conceive or even during pregnancy or after.
Now, you mentioned same-sex couples, but my husband and I had to sign off on contracts with the fertility clinic, and we are heterosexual.
Yes.
So, one thing that I thought when I was signing off on those contracts all those years ago was, should I get a lawyer to look at this contract? Because it seemed like it was a contract that was created by the fertility group that probably was there to protect them, but I mean, I would have signed off on anything at that point because I just wanted to move forward. But are those contracts still?
So you're bringing up great points. So first of all, you don't even realize, I think, what you said. All you wanted to do was move forward.
I did.
All you wanted was a baby.
That's all I wanted.
And most people, when they walk through the door of any fertility center, that's what they want.
Absolutely.
And that's what we all want.
Absolutely.
But that's what they're thinking about. And I think when you're saying contract, you might be talking about informed consent documents with a fertility center. You may not be talking about your contract with your gestational carrier. I'm not sure.
It may have been informed consent. I just know that I was required to sign off on paperwork.
Yep.
And they went through all these different scenarios.
Yes.
If something happens, who gets the embryos?
So you
divorce.
Yep. So you're talking about informed consent documents probably.
Okay.
So this is why it's good to, again, see a lawyer early on. And believe me, it's not about, I think, sometimes lawyers in the ART world get a little bit of a negative rap.
No.
Because people think, oh yes, believe it or not, because people aren't understanding really why do we need a lawyer early on. But you just hit the nail on the head. You have all these documents you have to weed through.
Absolutely.
You may or may not be really paying attention to them because you just want to sign off because you want to move forward.
Yes.
And get there. You want to have a baby.
Yes.
So it's not just about your surrogacy agreement with your surrogate if you're working with one, which you have to have a lawyer for, and there has to be, informed negotiated contracts that each party has their own attorney. We can talk about that.
Okay.
But also the informed consent documents, that is a document between yourself and the medical practice to undergo medical treatment.
Yes.
And you're supposed to be getting all the information you're talking about to make an informed decision to undergo treatment.
Yes.
So, and including what to do with unused frozen gametes or embryos. And those are things you're maybe not really thinking so closely about, which the attorney will focus you on and talk to you about what happens if something happens to one of you. What happens if you get divorced down the road? What's going to happen with those embryos?
Yeah.
And that's another reason why when we do our surrogacy agreements, we actually require the parents to meet with an attorney and go over and have a will. Because we want to make sure that they address what happens if, along the way, if something happens to them, including what happens to their frozen embryos. So that's going to be something that should be addressed in estate planning and in wills. So it touches other areas of the law that people may not even think about at the beginning. But getting back to the informed consent, you want to be informed. You want to understand, why do I have to answer these questions?
Yes.
What do I have to think about? Help me focus on that.
So should people who are going through fertility treatment, should they just get a lawyer? Should they lawyer up?
Yeah. It sounds funny because it's not a negative lawyer up, for sure.
But
I don't think it's a bad idea. Anytime you're going to sign a document, especially something that impacts your future,
yes,
you want to make sure you understand it.
Yes.
So even if somebody's going through routine IVF, although I rarely see somebody going through routine IVF, but you are signing documents including disposition of your embryos in the future, and maybe
Yes.
even frozen eggs or frozen sperm, that you want to know what are the legal implications for that down the road.
Well, and so this is makes me think about a couple of cases that I've seen recently on TV. One I think involved Sofia Vergara, and another one involved oh my goodness, she was on The View.
Sherry
Shepherd, but these cases where they started off
one way,
happy with their partners, and then things happened, and then everything went to court.
Right.
And it just made me think, if they had legal counsel instead of just signing whatever the documents were before they started the process, maybe they wouldn't have been that up.
So those are two very different scenarios and very different cases.
Okay.
There's no question that, from the 30,000 foot looking, balcony looking down.
Yes.
When you're dealing with any legal issues that could impact parentage, you should discuss it with an attorney.
Yes.
So the Sofia Vergara case is very different in that they were forming embryos with the hope of building a family. So that brings up what we talked about earlier, which is maybe it's a heterosexual couple comes in the door and they have to address use of embryos in the future if they're frozen, and why you really should have that conversation with a lawyer. So you really understand what it is you're signing. And that is an example of how courts are going, and this has happened in other cases, not just theirs, courts often are going to turn to what's in writing.
Yes.
What did the parties agree to? Well, when you don't have a legal agreement, the only agreement signed is those informed consent documents. So they're being viewed as contracts sometimes by the courts. What's the intent of the parties? So that's
Understood.
why a written, well-informed legal agreement is so important, especially in any third-party case. In that case, it didn't involve a third party, but it did involve a conversation and discussion about disposition of embryos that really needs to be thought out, because, like we just said 2 minutes ago, you walk in the door, you want to have a baby.
Absolutely.
You're not thinking, oh, we're going to fall apart, we're going to get divorced, we're going to get separated. But that's
Correct.
my job, is to think about what ifs. Under
The
this
what
scenario, what is it you would want to happen? Now, the Sherry Shepherd case was very different. There was a very clearly negotiated, signed legal agreement that involved the intended parents, that involved the gestational carrier, and at the end of the day, the court upheld that contract. It was very clear what the intent of the parties were, and they did do what they were supposed to do in that case. So it's two very different cases, and one involved a gestational carrier, one didn't.
Yes.
But it just highlights how critical that is, and every step of the way, to have informed conversations and full education, so you understand what decisions are you making, how might that impact if the what if happens.
Correct. And I think it's a lot cheaper to sit down with a lawyer on the front end and spend an hour of her time and understand what you're signing than to get farther down the line, have a problem, and then you're in court and my God, it's just it's a better process. And also their terms, I know that even as a physician, I didn't understand all the terms in the consent agreement.
Right.
Because it was written by a lawyer.
Right, specific. Or it might have been written by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine does have an arm that puts out model consent forms. It may have been written, they might have been using those consent forms.
It could have been.
That still, it was informed by legal, and the whole process is, informed consent is legally driven on some level. For sure, it's about medical treatment, but you just said it, even as, everybody comes to this from a different point of view, but you're not focused on what do all those terms mean if it's not something you do every day.
Certainly.
And this helps focus you in and really understand what decisions are you making, what are you weighing, what are you balancing, so that it's an informed decision. That, at the end of the day, through all of this, is it really needs to be thought through and informed. And I can't tell you how many times I'm involved in a known donor agreement that it turns out the parties have not necessarily thought through the whole process, including future contact. between themselves, between the resulting child. And sometimes it falls apart at that stage, which is really unfortunate, but they didn't really tease that apart enough that they were all on the same page. So
It
it's
was
so
just,
important.
give me the eggs, give me the sperm.
You know, it's, or well-intended parties. Oh, I want to help you have a baby.
Right.
But maybe I'll be a parent, or maybe I won't. Or I want to be very involved in this child's life, but I don't want to be a parent. Well, a court someday could find that by their actions they were behaving as a parent. That happens too. So there's so many reasons to have that conversation early on with an attorney. You asked a question a little while ago about definitions, and you said adoption, and I didn't address that. So I wanted to do that for a second.
Please.
Adoption is very highly regulated, and there are laws about adoption that have existed for a long time in the United States.
Okay.
Every state is a little different, but it is clearly centered, it's child-centered. It's centered around the best interest of the child, and it is a child in being that exists.
Yes.
So it's about what is best for the placement of that child. So what gets sometimes a little confused, and the legal structure for adoption is very different than anything that assisted reproductive technology deals with.
Okay.
So I think sometimes the terminology does get confused between when someone wants to give their embryo, they're no longer interested, they don't need their embryo. It's correctly called embryo donation.
Okay,
If you
not
look-
embryo adoption.
Correct. And if you look at the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, they have clearly defined this and also have issued guidelines and an understanding of what does adoption mean and what is embryo donation. And it's very different. So the structure is very different. In the world of donation, in the world of ART, as we said, it's about family building. It's about you exercising your right to procreate. There is no child in being yet, and I understand that people come to that from different angles. But if you look at the clearly defined reason for the adoption structure and embryo donation, they are a very different process. So it's very important for, I think, anyone in the field to really read and digest the ASRM guidelines, because I think they give a clear picture.
So why do some groups, quote unquote, allow embryos or facilitate embryo adoptions, or what they say is embryo adoptions? What does that, when they're doing that, given that, as you've described, adoption really relates to a child that is here right now?
Right.
What is that process? What is that, why?
Why do they do that?
Yes.
You know, look, I don't want to speak for others, and everyone has their own, what drives their practice.
Yeah.
I think there are those that do feel strongly that they debate when conception starts, when a life starts, and their feeling is different. So their process is called embryo adoption because they feel that that's what it is. But technically, it is not. And that's why I really do suggest that anyone looking into that field really do take some time to read the ASRM guidelines, because they very carefully lay out what the differences are. And as I said, adoption is very child-centered. It's a child that is already here, right?
And
with an embryo, we don't know whether there'll be conception. We don't know whether this will result in the birth of a child.
Right.
So at the time that the embryo is being given to an intended parent in the hopes of them being able to have a child, we don't even know if there'll ever be a child that results. It's there's a different reason for it, and there's a very different structure for handling it legally.
Okay, that's great. You reference ASRM guidelines?
Yes.
What are those?
So the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, again, is ASRM.
Yes.
Part of the alphabet soup that we keep talking about, so we can reiterate. They are an organization that does a lot of great work, including they issue ethical guidelines and practice guidelines that are updated every few years. So really, they're on the pulse of what's changing, what's happening, what are the issues. So if you're really looking for something and you want to dig into reading yourself, it has good information. But if you come to a lawyer like myself, I'll be able to share that information if it's something that you would like.
So if someone watching tonight, or someone who watches this next week or tomorrow, wants to find the ASRM guidelines, are they available for free?
Some of them they may be able to find, and some they may not.
Okay.
So if they come to a person like myself, I can share summaries with them, but some of the documents that are put out by SRM, you have to be a member to access them.
Okay.
But for sure, if they come to someone like myself, I can tell them what the best practices are.
Okay, so another reason to lawyer up, and another.
I feel like that's so negative.
No, I think it's a great thing, actually. I feel more protected when I'm in a situation that I'm a little uncomfortable with.
Yes.
When I have counsel from someone who knows what they're talking about. Which leads me to my next question. Why is it important not just to find a lawyer? Why is it important to find someone like yourself who actually does this full time as opposed to a more generalist?
Right. I think that's a great question. Look, I think 20 years ago, there weren't very many people around that do what I do. I think there are enough people that specialize now in this area that, like anything else, you want to go to an expert and get the best advice. So, if you're buying a house, you go to an expert that's going to help you with that.
Absolutely.
If I needed legal assistance with something I know nothing about, for example, I actually don't do wills. I feel like I can only wear so many hats, so I refer to certain other attorneys when my clients need a will. Now, I know some of the attorneys in my field do wills, which is great if that's something that they're educated on and an expert in. I just don't specialize in that.
Yes.
So I'm going to make sure I'm connecting my clients with someone who's a specialist in that field to give them the best advice.
Yes.
The same thing goes for any assisted reproductive technology case. You want to go to somebody who understands the law, who understands the breadth of the law and the differences between the states if you're working with parties in other states. You need to work with somebody who really understands the intricacies of this practice because it is very complex and it's not simple. I've had other family lawyers come and come to some of the conferences that we have, that we go over some of the different pieces of the puzzle.
Yes.
And they think that they want to get into this field, and afterward they might say, you know what, it's just we didn't realize how complex it is, because it is. You need to go to someone who can issue spot what are the issues. Or we can have a conversation that might last a half an hour about informed consent, because I know what we need to look at and how to get you to look at what decisions you need to make.
Right.
If you go to somebody who's not familiar, they may not even know what to have you look at, let alone how to guide you through that.
So what I'm hearing and what I completely agree with is, number one, it will probably save you time and money to work with someone who is an expert, because instead of them having to research and figure out what the law is, because she does this and others like her do this every day, they already know it. They can refer to the guideline, but it's just a part of their practice. So you're probably going to spend less time.
Yeah.
And number two, you want to make sure that for the same reason we need to get a lawyer when we are looking at contracts, just in case things don't go the way we hoped, we're protected. If you get if you get a contract created by someone who may not be as familiar with the topics, if things don't go the way that you had hoped and you end up in court, you may end up with an outcome that you did not anticipate. And recently I heard about a little case that was heartbreaking. A couple had adopted a little boy from foster care, and the lawyer made an error, made some mistakes, and the child was taken back and he ended up getting murdered by the birth family. And they successfully sued the lawyer because I guess maybe it was someone who wasn't as familiar.
Yeah. And I don't know about that case, so I don't know what happened. But it's the same for adoption. It's the same for anything.
Yes.
You want the advice that you're going to dot all your I's and cross your T's.
Absolutely.
Because you don't know what you're missing. And if you go to somebody this is not their field, they don't know what they're missing.
No, they don't.
I can't tell you how many times that I've represented a party where I've received a contract from an attorney who's not familiar with the field and wasn't working with a mentor or in a practice that was helping them grow into that field.
Yes.
And it takes a lot more time and energy, and frankly the client's finances, to fix that. And sometimes in doing that, you find out might fall apart because the parties were not on the same page. And you don't want that to happen.
No.
I know what questions to ask. Where are you in the process? Have you done this? I know what questions to see in terms of pre-screening and being ready for a contract.
Yes.
So if you come to somebody who doesn't know what those questions are, they might, you might retain them and pay them for a contract and even enter into a contract, only to find out that the third party you're working with is screened out, maybe medically or psychologically.
Oh my gosh.
So you also have to know what order should these pieces be done, because you're working with a team of professionals that's actually helping you
Yes.
get to baby.
Right.
And you're building family through third party assistance especially. But even, you mentioned before, even with the informed consent, you don't want to be one of those cases that land in court.
No.
That they're utilizing those informed consent documents as a contract between you and the person you were trying to have a family with, a child with.
So we are running very low on time. We're almost done. 2 last quick questions. How do I find a lawyer like yourself who has experience working in fertility law, what you refer to as ART law
Sure.
or adoption law?
Yeah. Well, there are a few ways you can do that. One, if you are working with a fertility practice, most will have referrals that they can refer you to.
Okay.
There are also a couple of organizations that have great resource. One is the American Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproductive Attorneys.
So
It's a
that's
mouthful.
AAAART.
It's actually Quad A now.
Quad A.
It's a one academy, and if you go to the website, there are attorneys in every state that are
Great.
listed. Also through the American Bar Association,
Okay.
there are attorneys that specialize in art that you can find that way. So there are lots of there's a lot of access to information. Of course, you can Google, like we can
Right.
Google everything.
Well, but you know, with Google, you might end up with
You're right.
someone who, does insurance.
Sure, and that's why I caution, anyone can put up a pretty website. So
Yes.
you want to make sure you ask about experience and references, how many cases they've done, what is their area of concentration, so you have a sense of who they are before you just jump in.
So, AAAA.com.
4 A's.
So, AAAA.com. Is that-
Org.
.org. So,
Yes.
AAAA.org. And then
The ABA
The
has a family
ABA.
law section that has a subsection of assisted reproductive technology attorneys.
and then
And for sure, use your fertility center as a resource if you're
Yes.
working with a mental health professional in the field.
yes.
Use the people you're working with as a resource because they'll know.
Okay. And then
And make sure you get references and ask about how long have they been doing it and find out about their experience.
that's so important. We could go on for probably another 6 or 7 hours. I've heard so many stories, and I have so many tales of my own. But thankfully, everything worked out well with my family, and I'm grateful we had great counsel. But I'm sitting here with an excellent counselor, so if you want to follow up with Meryl,
Please.
please
Yeah.
reach out to her website. And Meryl, could you give all your particulars?
Sure. My email is Meryl, MERYL, at artparenting.com. And the website can be found, artparenting.com. There's a lot of information. Happy to answer any questions. I always say there's no too many questions and there's no silly questions. Better to ask a lot of questions than to be in the dark.
And Meryl is an incredible woman and advocate for families with infertility. So thank you so much for being on tonight. And then our last question, what's in your mug?
In my mug is coffee.
And in my mug is water. So cheers
to family building.
to family building and overcoming infertility.
Yes.
Yay.
Yes. Thank
All right.
you.
Good night.